Hello everyone. My name is Adi Mukapatnam, and today I have Amol Sinha with me. He's the executive director of the ACLU of New Jersey, and he's held that position for over 8 years. And under his leadership, the ACLU of New Jersey has had a lot of great accomplishments. One of which is, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, New Jersey has seen a 42% reduction in prison population since March of 2020. And that number is just quite astonishing, honestly. And some of the battles and legislation that the ACLU of New Jersey has been dealing with include the New Jersey Voter Empowerment Act, which is to expand voter rights for New Jerseyans, the New Jersey Immigrant Trust Act, which tries to protect immigrants in New Jersey from Trump's crackdowns, and we'll talk about that act in detail in just a few minutes. And also the Senate 3452 bill, which improves access to abortion and reproductive health care. These are some of the legislative battles that Amol has been leading. And also recently, a courtroom battle that Amol has been leading is that the ACLU of New Jersey just filed a complaint on behalf of 6 current or former Rutgers students who have had their F1 visas wrongfully terminated. And I'm sure we'll touch on all of these different issues throughout our interview. But first, I'd like to welcome Amol. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be here and talk to us. I'd first like to ask you about the decarceration efforts. This is an issue very close to my heart as someone who wants to be a career public defender. 42% decrease in just 5 years. That is an insane number. Can you tell me some of the key moments in that battle? What were some of the most important things that happened, and how did you get there?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, Adi. I really appreciate you and the work that you do. Let me just say that decarceration has been a core pillar of our work for a very long time. Well before I started at the ACLU of New Jersey, we set a goal to end mass incarceration in our state. And what we meant by that was to reduce our prison population by as much as possible so that we could see people liberated and free and also not using prison as a measure of first resort in every instance. And so, it's been a goal of ours for a long time. The statistic that you cited from the Prison Policy Institute, that uh, counted from March 2020, right? And what happened in March 2020 was that COVID hit the United States. And so at that moment, at that juncture, when the whole world was like figuring out this new normal that we were living in, we at the ACLU of New Jersey were doing the same thing. We were thinking about how to continue our work. And we were thinking about how we could actually have an impact in this moment when it seemed like everybody was figuring out all of the different things that they had to, including how to keep themselves safe. And what we learned very quickly was that of all of the different populations that the state government had to think about, whether it was kids in school or frontline workers or medical workers or people in nursing homes, it seemed like the last group of people that they would think about were people in prison. And as you know, people in prison were some of the most vulnerable to COVID-19. And that's because prisons weren't designed with social distancing in mind. They were designed to warehouse people in close quarters. And so the things that we could do on the outside were impossible to do on the inside. And so, whether we could socially distance, whether we could use hand sanitizer, right? These are things that were easy to do to keep ourselves safer on the outside, but impossible in some instances inside prisons. And so we decided to focus in on that population. And we came up with a strategy. In our work, we use this model of integrated advocacy, where we use all of the tools in our toolbox, whether it's litigation, legislative advocacy, strategic communications, public education. We use all of the tools to achieve our policy goals. And in that moment, when we realized that New Jersey had one of the worst rates of death related to COVID in its prisons in the country,
Wow.
and also one of the worst racial disparities in prisons in the country. We knew that not only was this an issue that was impacting New Jerseyans in prison, it was also a deep racial justice issue. And so we chose to think about the different ways in which we could help people who are incarcerated. We first decided to litigate. and we had a lawsuit that resulted. Long story short, it resulted in a consent order that led to 700 people being released from county jails in New Jersey. So these were people that were convicted of lesser crimes, and they were sentenced to sentences ranging from, a few months to a year. And so 700 people were let out. We then wrote and shared with the governor an executive order that would create a pathway for more people to get out. And the governor issued a version of that led to a few hundred people getting out of prison. But ultimately, what we decided to do was go to the legislature, and we wrote a bill that we called the Public Health Emergency Credit.
Right.
And what this bill did was it basically took time off of people's sentences if they were set to be released within a year anyways. The theory being that people went to prison people went to prison not knowing that there was going to be a public health emergency in their future. And when people are cut off from their families, their lawyers, there were very limited medical services. They weren't getting other sorts of services or things that were designed for them. We wanted to make sure that there was a remedy to this, and the way we came up with that was by offering people time off of their sentences, and it resulted in over the course of 2020 to 2022, we saw a total of about 9,000 people released from prison and jails in New Jersey's
Wow.
prisons. And so, yes, at that time, it was a more than 40% decrease in our prison population. And now New Jersey has one of the lowest rates of incarceration in the country. There are states that are similarly sized that have 3 times as many people incarcerated in their states, and that's a real boon to New Jersey's population. And by the way, I'll mention that just as we have reduced the prison population in our state, crime across pretty much every category has continued to trend downward as well. And so we've increased public health and public safety and also liberated a whole bunch of people in our state. And we've shown that safety and decarceration are not at odds with one another.
Right. You touched on a lot of different issues there, race, public health. And what I'm hearing from you is that it was a very holistic move to make this happen. It wasn't
Yeah.
just focusing on one thing. And if I could just add one thing onto that, what I saw in Miami, somewhere between 75 to 85% of the prison population were indigent,
Yeah.
right? So not just race, but the role that class plays and the role that it plays even the minute you leave custody, and the inability to, even small things like buying soap, I'm assuming would have an effect on inmates that just get released. So what are your observations in terms of indigent inmates and the role that class played in those decarceration efforts, and how did that bill that you talked about address that, if it did at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have statistics on how many people who are incarcerated are indigent, although I would guess that the vast majority of people in New Jersey prisons are people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum, and they can't uh and in fact, as we know, being wealthy sometimes gets you out of a lot of trouble that people who don't have resources end up staying in. And so Brian Stevenson talks about this all the time. Where he says the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. And it's because there's this strong correlation between, wealth and your outcome in the criminal legal system. And so, New Jersey is no exception. So I'm sure that a huge number of New Jersey's prison population is indigent. And so we are, I'm seeing a lot of glimmers of that throughout our work, right? Like whether it's thinking about the work that we did during the public health emergency credit, or thinking about what we're doing now, which is the Clemency Project, which I could talk about for a sec. The Clemency Project is basically we uh, when Governor Murphy started his second term in New Jersey, we were thinking about all of the different ways we wanted to continue the work of decarceration. And we had, in some ways, reached our goals through the public health emergency credit. We had significantly reduced the prison population, and I kind of facetiously asked our staff, are we done or is there more that we have to do in this space? And we realized at that time that Governor Murphy, during his first term, had not issued a single pardon. And so this is a power, right? The pardon power is a power that governors enjoy. And it's surprising that a governor wouldn't use it. And so we decided at that time, look, we have 4 years left of Governor Murphy. And here's an opportunity for us to work with his administration to figure out how we can get them to do what we want them to do. And so we came up with this idea of the Clemency Project to help people who are incarcerated but shouldn't be. And we came up with this idea that the governor should embrace a categorical approach to clemency. So rather than waiting for the politically connected person or the sympathetic story to make its way to his desk, why don't we proactively find the people that should no longer be incarcerated because of the nature of their crime or the injustice of their punishment or the length of time that they've already served? There are all these different factors that we can look to. And we came up with two categories in particular. One was victims of domestic violence who are incarcerated because they attack their abusers. And the second was people who are incarcerated because of what's called a trial penalty or a trial tax. And these are people who are incarcerated because they say, just giving myself as an example, say I was accused of a crime, whether it's assault or something like that. One of the first steps in the process is that I may be presented with a plea offer. And it's my constitutional right to reject that plea offer, say it's 5 years, to reject that plea offer and go to trial. And there are so many instances where somebody would go to trial after rejecting a plea offer of 5 years and then get convicted and get a sentence of 25 years or 30 years. And so our theory was, if a prosecutor thought that public safety could be served by 5 years, why is it that we're allowing people to languish in prison for an additional 20, 30, and sometimes 40 years? There's an injustice there. And we know that it's going to take a lot to solve the system, the coercive nature of plea bargaining.
Sure.
And we're not saying that we have the solution for it ready to go, but what we're saying is that the governor has a tool to address the injustice that's caused by it. And
Absolutely.
and so we encourage him to embrace it. And so thankfully, the governor issued an executive order that basically outlined what it was that he intended to do, which included embracing our categories. And so far, Governor Murphy has issued more pardons and commutations than all governors of the past 30 years in New Jersey combined. And he's still going. And that includes, I think, 7 of our clients who have been released after serving and being sentenced to pretty extreme sentences. So these are people that have been accused of homicide and they've been serving decades or life in prison in some instances, and they've been released. And so back to your original question about the intersection with class, indeed, these are people that are coming out without much, right? And they are people that are going to need support in getting back into the outside life. But my hope is that with a system of reentry and ability to connect with resources in the outside world, we'll be able to make sure that people thrive in New Jersey.
Gotcha.
So many people are left behind because they simply don't have the resources.
Right. And that's unfortunate, but it is heartwarming to see, especially in this political era, a politician wielding his leverage for justice. That's nice to hear. I want to transition a little bit to talk
Yep.
about immigration. So I don't want to go do a broad overview of the Immigrant Trust Act because the ACLU has very nifty, handy graphics for people to understand those. I just want to focus on one thing that I found very interesting in that act, which is, maybe it's not something I quite understand and you can explain it to me. What is the mechanism by which that act would prevent local law enforcement from cooperating with federal enforcement, immigration enforcement? Am I getting that right as one of the legislative goals of that bill?
Right. So the Immigrant Trust Act is a bill that would limit cooperation between local law enforcement and other agencies with federal immigration enforcement. And it would limit information sharing and things like that. The Immigrant Trust Act is predated by the Immigrant Trust Directive, which is a directive from the Office of the Attorney General that basically says that local law enforcement shall not share information with federal law enforcement when it comes to immigration status and things like that. The AG's office has unique power in New Jersey in that it's different from many other attorney general's offices across the country. The AG's office has the ability to set binding policy for all law enforcement agencies and prosecutors in the state. And so, they can say through directive that law enforcement can no longer communicate with ICE or other people unless it's germane to the investigation in some way. The Immigrant Trust Directive would the Immigrant Trust Act, excuse me, would codify the Immigrant Trust Directive and then extend it to other agencies as well. Because we know that there are other agencies in New Jersey that have the ability to collect information on immigration status and have the ability to share that with the federal government, but this would prevent them from doing so. And in terms of the question about the mechanism, it would be a violation of law for agencies to engage in that sort of information sharing should the Immigrant Trust Act pass. And so, it would be a series of, I would imagine there would have to be regulatory policies written and agency policies written to make sure that they are complying with the Immigrant Trust Act. And it would, require a lot of vigilance and implementation to make sure that we're doing it right.
And what another aspect that I wanted to understand is the enforcement of it, because I understand that it would be illegal for them to cooperate with other
Yeah.
agencies if that law were to be codified. But what I've seen that is in public defender offices, prosecutor offices, and even with law enforcement, a lot of these things are kind of automated, right? Like there are softwares that kind of just flag a person's immigration status and they get an ICE hold that puts them in a separate category. And we have to do that. We have to do the immigration processing as well to help them get out of custody. And there are risks to getting them out of custody because now that they've been flagged, they're technically ripe for deportation.
Yeah.
If ICE wanted to pick them up, they could. So it sounds great. The law sounds great. I'm just curious as to how these little nitty gritty enforcement things will actually happen in real life.
Yeah, so one aspect that could happen is disassociating with those pieces of software and those databases, right? So there are databases that collect that information and share it automatically with ICE or federal law enforcement. And so we would need to make sure that we're not participating in those spaces
Gotcha.
anymore. There's also routine information sharing about who's getting out of prison or who has a court date and things like that's happening in states across the country where you see ICE agents show up to court and detain people right after their court hearings. And I know that New York is fighting this right now, and they're trying to stop ICE agents from doing that because not only does that cause harm to that family after the court hearing, it also is a deterrent to for people to show up to court in the first instance, right? And so it undermines the justice system as a whole if we allow for ICE to run rampant in our courts.
Absolutely. So I just want to put the Immigrant Trust Act within the context of the New Jersey gubernatorial race. And, just want to hear your thoughts on what some of these candidates have said or not said about the Immigrant Trust Act. So we know that back in May, Mayor Ross Baraka went to visit Delaney Hall along with a few Congress people. He got arrested. And since then, he's been very vocal about denouncing Trump's immigration crackdown, but he specifically supports the Immigrant Trust Act. He said that on his campaign trail. I believe he said that in debates as well. And at a specific governor's debate in February, there were 6 Democratic candidates on stage, and they were all asked if one of the goals of the next governor should be protecting immigrants in the state, whether they're here legally or not. And every Democratic candidate raised their hand except for Representative Mikey Sherrill. And in that same debate, Representative Gottheimer went on to criticize the Immigrant Trust Act, saying that there are legal risks. Representative Sherrill said the same thing, that the legislation and language need tweaks. So from the ACLU's perspective, are there legal risks? What are they? And why is that a problem?
Yeah, I'll say this: the Immigrant Trust Directive, the AG directive that I mentioned, it's been challenged in court and it survived judicial scrutiny. And so, in fact, it survived on multiple occasions, including in one instance before a Trump appointed judge. And
Right.
so we've seen the Immigrant Trust Directive succeed in court. It's been upheld as constitutional. It's allowed to live on, and it's continued to be binding policy for New Jersey's law enforcement across the state. I think that there is good reason to believe that the Immigrant Trust Act would withstand such scrutiny as well.
Right.
And there is good reason to believe that we will succeed should the Immigrant Trust Act be challenged in court. And look, just because there may be some legal concerns, I'll admit it. Like, there's 100% chance that if the Immigrant Trust Act passes, there are going to be people that sue regarding it, right? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
100% that there will be a lawsuit trying to challenge the Immigrant Trust Act. But you know, whoever our next governor is should not only pass policies that they're not going to get sued about, right? Like they should. You can't be in government if you're afraid of being sued. And so it's really important that we do what's right for New Jerseyans, regardless of whether or not we may face a lawsuit as a state in the future. And there's good reason to believe that we'll be able to succeed in a lawsuit, just as we did with the Immigrant Trust Directive. And the Attorney General of our state, and, w- even with pieces of legislation where he's flagged legal concern, it is their responsibility to defend the laws of New Jersey. And so if the Immigrant Trust Act is part of the legal infrastructure of New Jersey, the Attorney General's office is going to defend it. And they have some of the best lawyers in the country. And I firmly believe that we will it survive any sort of judicial scrutiny. I think the legal risks are overstated. And I also think that the potential benefits of it are understated. And so I'll also say that it's been said that the Immigrant Trust Act won't protect people from deportation. It will only limit information sharing. It's not going to. So there are some lawmakers and gubernatorial candidates that have said they don't want to give people false hope. Well, look, there is no panacea. There is no silver bullet. All we can do is try to chip away at the onslaught of attacks that our communities are facing. And all
Right.
we can do is put up as much of a firewall as possible against the Trump administration's agenda. And
Right.
so if our answer is to do nothing, then that's not acceptable. And so what we need to do is do the things that the legislature has the power to do, and make sure that we're doing it to the fullest extent of our ability so that we can protect the most vulnerable New Jerseyans.
I want to make sure we get to our next topic, so I'm going to lump a
Yeah.
couple of questions in together here. The ACLU is very open about legislation that they support, right? They even don't hesitate to write advisory letters to Congress or state legislatures. So considering, that kind of openness, would it be fair to say that Congresswoman Cheryl and Congressman Gottheimer are actively working against the goals of the ACLU, and maybe even actively working against the rights of immigrants and New Jerseyans?
No, I don't think that's fair to say. I think, look, at the ACLU, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we have no friends and no enemies, as they say, right? Like we are consistently trying to live by our principles and trying to execute on those principles through legislation and litigation. And there's no elected office holder, and there is no candidate for office that satisfies us 100%. That is fully values aligned with us. There are instances where lawmakers of all stripes disappoint us, and there are instances where lawmakers that we wouldn't expect to align with us align with us. And so, we find common ground with unlikely partners all the time. And we also are disappointed by some of the people that we consider to be our champions. And
Yeah.
so our work is to make sure that we are advocating to people in positions of power to champion civil rights and liberties and defend the rights and liberties of New Jerseyans and everybody across the country. And I think we've been a hugely successful organization with our partners because of our commitment to our principles. And we're I pride myself and my organization on the fact that we are an honest broker. We say the same thing to everybody on any issue. We articulate what our position is. We're not shy about telling you when we disagree. So it's I think it's important to note that regardless of who the next governor of New Jersey is, whether it's, the Democratic nominee, Mikey Sherrill, or whether it's the Republican nominee, Jack Ciattarelli, we will strive to hold that person accountable. And also we will strive to work with them to make sure that we're defending the rights and liberties of New Jerseyans. We've
Yeah.
sued under every administration in New Jersey, and we've sued under every presidential administration, regardless of their party ideology. And so we expect to continue doing that.
And I completely hear you. And I think you're exactly right, considering the history of the ACLU. It is a nonpartisan organization, and it has been honest in the way it advocates. But it's undeniable that certain politicians can make your job harder. And I hear what you say about politicians not always aligning up with you. But when a likely ally fails you over and over again, it becomes a bit more than that. And I just want to stick a pin in that because I want to come back to that when we're talking about our next topic of speech and ask you about some of the external influences regarding the Immigration Trust Act. Now, the Kitchen Table Conservatives PAC has been throwing money into New Jersey politics for a long time. And I think there recently, there's a lot of attack ads that are anti-immigrant in nature. They haven't specifically targeted the Trust Act, but they have helped develop a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, equating all immigrants with violent crime. And there's also the GEO group who owns Delaney Hall, and there's Core Civic. These are major ICE contractors. They're major Trump campaign donors, and it's very obvious that it's in their financial benefit to lock up as many people as possible, both in the immigration context and the criminal context, right? So I'm just curious as to how the ACLU deals with that. Like, what are your lobbying strategies? Because I assume a big part of getting legislation passed is to talk to these people and talk to politicians. So whether it's the organizations themselves or politicians who may or may not take donations from them, what are your strategies in terms of lobbying?
So first of all, thank you for the question. Look, we develop and hold expertise on issues, right? Like, and we try to be as well versed on the issues as possible, so that we can have conversations with everybody on the issue, regardless of where they fall on the ideological spectrum. There are going to be people who need to be convinced and can be convinced, and there are going to be people who cannot be convinced and we're not going to have an audience with, and we're just going to have to disagree.
Yeah.
And so when there are people who are, say, taking money from the Geo group or any other group that facilitates immigration detention, that's an articulation of where their values are. When it's public, we know that there are institutions that are trying to benefit from the incarceration of people and trying to separate families, and there are lawmakers that are complicit in that or actively trying to do it as well. And so what we're trying to do is to uphold our principles. Like I said, we're not afraid to disagree. And so I think that there ought to be a political consequence to lawmakers who are hostile to civil rights and liberties and actually harm their constituents. And we're going to make sure that there is, right? And so we are doing things, whether it's organizing people, registering people to vote, making sure that people have a voice in their communities. We are utilizing, our platform in the media. We're utilizing social media as well to champion our principles and hold people accountable to them. And so our lobbying strategy includes developing the expertise, having the meetings that we need to have, securing the champions, and also thinking about the consequences for not doing right by your constituents. How do we make sure that our voices are felt and that the people power that we're trying to generate across communities in the state is seen? And so that's a constant part of our work. And
Yeah.
also, I will say, look, like I mentioned, we use this model of integrated advocacy. We also have one of the best litigation departments in the state and in the country. And so when we have lawmakers that are hostile to civil rights and liberties, that pass laws that are undermining people's rights and liberties, we will try to protect them through the courts as well.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that answer. And I just want to highlight what you said about expertise and values,
Yeah.
because a lot of the time in conversations like this, it's easy to get cynical. But at least in my experience, I've worked with the American Association of Justice when I was in law school, and they also do a lot of lobbying for plaintiffs in mass tort cases who are, the opposition. There are huge moneyed interests, and
Yeah.
they say the same thing. If you live your ideals and you are honest about it, and you have the expertise to deliver on it, you would be surprised by how many minds you can actually change. So
Hmm.
I appreciate that answer. I just want to transition here to the next topic, which is the ACLU's representation of Mahmoud Khalil
Hmm.
and the issue of pro-Palestinian speech in general. So the ACLU of New Jersey joined Mahmoud Khalil's legal team in March of this year. You've spoken publicly about this case. You've said that the First Amendment rights are at the core of this case. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of speech issues, I just want to understand what was the procedural like linchpin that freed Khalil, right? Like I was trying to go through all the court documents. There's a lot of them, and I don't think I quite understood the procedural aspects of what actually got him free, because it wasn't simply a matter of arguing constitutional rights for him to get released, right?
So the issue was whether or not he should be detained pending the merits of the case, right?
Right.
And so we haven't yet gotten to the merits of the case about whether or not he should have been arrested in the first place. But the question was whether or not he should be detained before we get to the merits. And there were a couple of different factors at play. One of them was whether or not he is a flight risk and whether or not he violated the foreign policy grounds of immigration law, which basically says that they can go after people. The administration can go after people who they deem to be uh, uh, a a foreign policy, a threat to the foreign policy interests of the United States. And then there was this other issue of whether or not the ad hoc or post hoc, you know, allegation that Mr. Khalil had made an error on his visa application or his permanent residency application, whether that should be the basis for detention.
Yeah.
And a judge in New Jersey said, no, he is not a flight risk. The foreign policy grounds that the government is citing to detain him is likely unconstitutional. And excuse me, let me backtrack on that and repeat it, Adi, if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, a federal judge in New Jersey said that he is not a flight risk and he's not a danger to communities. Secondly, they said that the foreign policy grounds that the government is citing to detain him is likely unconstitutional. And thirdly, they said that it is unacceptable that he be detained for this post hoc administrative or technical violation that the administration is alleging. And so, on all fronts, the judge decided that he should no longer be detained pending his trial. And so this is an incredible win, of course. His freedom was incredibly important in this moment, so that he can be with his family and his newborn son, and make sure that he's there for these life moments. But he never should have been detained in the first instance. He was detained
Yeah.
for 104 days, right? For 104 days, in one of the worst facilities in the country in Louisiana. He was ripped away from his family. He was ripped away from access to legal counsel and the communities that he has been with. He missed graduation. He missed family moments. He missed the birth of his son. While it's heartwarming that he gets to be back home right now, it's also outrageous and shocking what happened to him.
Yeah, it's beyond shocking, and especially post 9/11, being brown. You grow up with these kinds of horror stories that you hear that can happen, and to see it as an adult who's, understanding most of what's going on in the law and politics, it is genuinely shocking, to say the least. So I just want to move on to slightly broader speech issues. It's not just Mahmoud Khalil, but we've seen the arrest of people like Ramezia Ozturk for writing an op-ed. It seems almost like every other day there are crackdowns on campuses around the country. Students are being denied their diplomas for their pro-Palestinian speech. And not just students, but also faculty. And the ACLU has been public about warning Congress that universities are being pressured to restrict speech critical of the Israeli government out of fear of the college losing federal funding. I mean, that is just, we're talking about the supposedly greatest institutions of education, champions of liberal arts and civic education and engagement in the world. These institutions are actively trading civil liberties for money. So I just have to ask you, what do you make of this cowardice, from some of the top universities in the world?
Yeah. I am disappointed to see the capitulation that we've been seeing from universities and law firms and so many other institutions. At the core of it, though, is the Trump administration's assault on the rule of law. Right, so they are going after people that they disagree with, whether it's law firms that practice quote unquote illegal DEI or universities that are doing research and other sorts of things that they don't want to fund, or students like the ones that you mentioned, like Mahmoud Khalil, like Rumeisa Ozturk, like Mohsen Madawi, or Professor Kansuri. Those are all people that they disagree with and they see as their political enemies. And so the Trump administration is going after them. They are also going after vulnerable groups, those who are politically vulnerable. Like I'm thinking about, transgender students and also the immigrant communities all across the country. These are people that don't have the same sort of political voice as other groups do, and they are in some ways easy targets, and they also rile up the Trump administration's base. And
Right.
so they're going after these people to score cheap political points.
Yeah.
And so while I'm disappointed by, for lack of a better word, the self preservation that I've been seeing from colleges and universities and law firms and other corporate entities, I'm also encouraged by some of the ones that have resisted. Now, there are law firms that have resisted and have won. There are universities that have doubled down and have said that they're not going to allow for academic freedom to be tarnished on their campuses. And so, I do think there's a role for all of us to do more, and I would hope that universities would do more, because these are, as you say, some of the bastions of speech and thought and debate, and we need universities to be that way. But I wanted to go back to the Khalil case and the others like it for a sec and just say this. Look, at the end of the day, this is about free speech, right? What we're talking about is free speech, which is part of the cornerstone of our democracy. If we do not have free speech, then we can no longer call ourselves a democracy in this country. Uh, and that means free speech for all. It's not just speech that you and I agree with. It's not just speech that the Trump administration approves of. It's free speech for all. And we can't have a world in which the government gets to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't. That's how autocracies form. And so what I am saying to as many people as possible is that regardless of where you fall on the ideological spectrum on any issue, but particularly the issue about Israel and Palestine, regardless of where you fall on that, if you care about speech, if you care about democracy, if you care about holding government accountable, if you care that, we should not live in a society where the government can make you disappear simply because it disagrees with you, then you should be outraged by what's happening to Mahmoud Khalil, Rumeisa Ozturk, Mohsen Madawi, and so many others that the Trump administration is going after.
Absolutely. And on that issue of speech, just to break it down a little further, there have been attempts to pass various legislation at the national level that would definitely infringe upon First Amendment rights. The first one I want to talk about is the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The ACLU, again, has been very publicly against this legislation. I believe Jenna Leventoff, who's a ACLU National Senior Policy Advisor, wrote to the Senate back in November of last year, and I'm quoting from that letter here. He says, instead of addressing anti-Semitism on campus, this misguided legislation would punish protected political speech. She also wrote, it would likely chill free speech on college campuses by incorrectly equating criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism. I'm just curious to see what you think of Leventoff's analysis of that bill, and if you agree with her.
I agree with her 100%. There is serious concern for about these bills that try to define anti-Semitism, because they do exactly what my colleague says, which is that they would conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And I think that is deeply flawed. And so it's not just the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in Congress, there are state versions of these
Yeah.
bills as well, including one that's simmering in New Jersey. And we're opposed to that bill at the state level as well.
Yeah. Um, and in terms of understanding the legality of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, part of the bill would direct the Department of Education to adopt the IHRA definition of
Right.
anti-Semitism, right? The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And in a case called Students for Justice in Palestine v. Abbott, which was decided in October of last year, a Texas federal court found that the IHRA definition most likely violates the First Amendment. In that holding, the judges called it a viewpoint discrimination and held that the definition is also overly broad and would therefore be unconstitutional. Would you agree with that kind of holding? Does that reasoning from that court make sense to you?
It does, and that's exactly what we've been telling lawmakers here in New Jersey is that this is an overbroad attempt to try to define, so let me rephrase. This is exactly what we've been telling lawmakers in New Jersey. It is an attempt to censor people's speech, and the definition that folks are trying to push would censor speech, especially on campus, that may be critical of Israel. And we can't have a definition that would undermine the First Amendment, right? It would
Yeah.
clearly undermine and chill speech across New Jersey. And so when judicial rulings that say that, bills like these are likely unconstitutional, that should be a wake up call to lawmakers who are trying to pass them. And, they should realize that not only are they doing harm by censoring people, they're not doing much to address anti-Semitism either. And so I think this is a way for lawmakers to feel like they're doing something without having to do anything. And in fact, what they're doing is suppressing legitimate speech.
Yeah. And let's talk about, some of those lawmakers and, maybe their potential motivations in supporting these acts. Senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, he not only voted for the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, he co-sponsored it, right? Would you say that it's fair? Is it fair to say that Cory Booker is acting against New Jerseyans' First Amendment rights by co-sponsoring a bill like that?
Yeah, look, I think there is a real problem of anti-Semitism, whether it's
Yeah.
in New Jersey or beyond. I think I've seen the data. Hate incidents against Jewish community members have increased. I
Yeah.
think there are better ways to address it than by trying to define anti-Semitism in a way that hinders speech and doesn't actually get at the problem. And I'm disappointed with any lawmaker that thinks that this might be a way to solve anti-Semitism because clearly it's not.
Yeah.
And so what I feel is happening is that people are kind of losing the plot, right? Like we are doing something that we think is going to address a problem, but it's not going to address it. It's actually going to cause harm in another area that,
Yeah.
that is, that's going to be more problematic long term. And, the thing about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is that, if it passes, if we decide that, the IHRA definition or any other definition is the right one, and these definitions are overbroad and they end up violating speech rights, then the next religion that comes along is going to want a definition.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a definition of Islamophobia. There's going to be a definition of anti-Hindu bigotry. There's going to be a definition of
Yeah.
anti-Christian bigotry. And all of these things are going to chip away at speech rights. They're going to chip away at the values that we hold dear. But just because speech is speech that one disagrees with or one finds offensive, it doesn't mean that it's right to censor it or that there should be a criminal punishment for expressing those views. But I'll go back to saying that the anti-Semitism definition that we're seeing is not doing anything to protect Jewish communities.
Yeah.
What it will simply do is chill or censor criticism of Israel, which a lot of people believe is legitimate.
Yeah. Um, just to stay on this topic, so there's another piece of legislation, Senate Bill 720, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. I believe it was senior staff attorney, ACLU National again, Brian House, that wrote that this act would criminalize peaceful political activism, exactly what we've been talking about, and that this act would infringe on First Amendment rights. And once again, it's Senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, who co-sponsored this bill, voted for this bill. And if you remember earlier, we were talking about politicians disappointing us, not just as a once in a blue moon type of thing, but repeatedly and systematically disappointing us. Do you think, again, his actions, which are clearly against the position of the ACLU, are an infringement of Americans' First Amendment rights?
You were asking me about Senator Booker. He's been, not only has he been, let me say this in a way that I actually mean it. Look, every lawmaker, regardless of what level they're at, has things that we align with and things that we disagree on. And so, Senator Booker is no exception. He's been a champion with us on a number of different issues, including on criminal legal reform, cannabis legalization, and so many others, helping the most vulnerable among us. And we've also disagreed on things, including the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and other things that he's sponsored over the years. And one of our greatest strengths as an organization is that we get to have honest conversations with lawmakers, including Senator Booker. He will tell you himself firsthand that we disagree on a lot, and we tell him when we disagree. And so we're going to continue to champion our values and protect New Jerseyans' rights. And I don't think it's fair to paint any one lawmaker as saying that they are going to undermine the constitutional rights wholesale of our communities, because there are things that Senator Booker and others have done that uplift and protect and defend the constitutional rights of our communities. But there are also things that they've done that potentially infringe on the constitutional rights of our communities. Individuals are complex, so are lawmakers. And, I would hope that they would vote the right way or do things to protect rights more often than they do.
Yeah.
But, I think it's important to make sure that we are making our voices heard and holding lawmakers and others in power accountable to the laws that they pass and the constituencies that they serve, so that we are not perpetuating injustice.
And I completely hear you, and I agree with you that Cory Booker has, pushed a lot of legislation that is very helpful in a lot of different ways, like the cannabis situation. But it's important to parse that out because each piece of legislation is different. The
Yep.
forces moving behind them are different. And the motivations for politicians to behave differently on different legislations are different. So just to talk about what could be potentially Senator Booker's motivation behind these two bills that we just talked about. The Intercept reported that in 2019, Senator Booker gave a speech behind closed doors to AIPAC. In this recording, it showed that he said, in reference to Mort Friedman, AIPAC's president, and I quote here, that Senator Booker and Mort Friedman talk often and text message back and forth like teenagers. And I have another report here from Open Secrets that shows super PACs like DMFI, NORPAC, JAC, FIPAC, APAC collectively have given Senator Booker almost $900,000 towards his campaigns over the last decade. Do you think that this financial support and this kind of revolving door dynamic that politicians can sometimes maintain have a direct impact on the way they vote? And in this case, do you think Cory Booker is impacted by this money as to how he votes?
I mean, I can't speak for him, but I think it's important to see these where politicians, um, m- you know, I think it's important to see corporate donations to lawmakers. I think it's important to understand where money is coming from and how it's influencing our politics. But I think it's important also to hold lawmakers accountable and make sure that regardless of where their money is coming from or where their campaign donations are coming from, that they are adhering to principles of justice and fairness and equality, and that they are doing right by their constituents. So
Yeah,
I can't opine on Senator Booker's motivations.
of course, yeah.
And, I would encourage you to talk to him and his team about that. But he definitely has, he has both a track record of being a champion, and there are some instances where I think he needs to evolve.
Thank you for that. That's a very honest answer, and I appreciate it. So I know that we've been talking about speech in the context of pro-Palestinian speech and these acts and the Trump administration. But Citizens United, let me just break that down for whoever may be listening so they understand. Citizens United is a landmark Supreme Court decision that was made in 2010 which, to put it in a nutshell, equates money with speech and equates corporations to people. This is what allows the existence of super PACs. And super PACs are a financial mechanism to fund political campaigns without having to have the same financial limitations as a 501c3 nonprofit like the ACLU Foundation, for example. So I'm just curious as to what you think about Citizens United and the role it plays in speech, in our politics, and if you or the ACLU in general has any plans to combat money in politics in any substantive way.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're going to continue to keep an eye on the docket at large, right? Whether it's the Supreme Court of the United States or federal courts below it or state courts for these issues. But at the end of the day, you know, um, when political donations, when the Supreme Court has held that political donations and money in politics is a form of speech, we are not going to be in a position to say that should be limited, right? Like it is, I understand full well about the impact of money in politics, but if the Supreme Court has ruled that it is akin to speech, then we are going to try to make sure that we are taking a position that is consistent with our free speech values, and that's really important to do. But I understand the controversy behind Citizens United. I understand why it's sparked such debate. But any rule that might limit which political speech is legitimate or which form of speech is more valued than another is going to have some constitutional problems. And so we're going to keep an eye out for these sorts of cases to make sure that our voice is heard.
Yeah, and I understand with the traditional methods of the ACLU, which is litigation and legislation, fighting against a Supreme Court decision is pretty much impracticable. I get that. But there are some pathways to overturn Citizens United, right? I worked for a organization called Wolfpack, and their goal was to introduce a constitutional amendment. And again, there's multiple ways to do that, as you know. The path that Wolfpack chose to further a constitutional amendment to make all the campaign finance public was to get the states to ratify for an amendment. And I believe you need 2/3 of the states to do that. And still, that's a huge uphill battle. Has the ACLU considered constitutional amendments of this kind as a possible solution to Citizens United?
Yeah, I think I'll have to get back to you on that, but my understanding is that if there is a constitutional amendment to limit free speech, then we are going to oppose it. I
Right.
don't think that's the solution here. There are other ways to try to better our politics than to issue a constitutional amendment that undermines the First Amendment, does some harm.
One thing I communicated to you early on, when we, started talking about the potential of an interview, is my personal interest in injecting some academic framework into the way we understand politics. So there's scholars like Wendy Brown, for example. She's a political theorist at UC Berkeley. She has argued, as well as many other scholars, that what we're seeing is not just a local phenomena of rise of authoritarianism, but a global one, right? We see strongman figures pop up around the world, like Trump, like Narendra Modi, like Erdogan in Turkey or Bolsonaro in Brazil. And obviously, there's a lot of different factors that are going to be distinct with these authoritarian figures, but there are some global concepts that seem to be common. And one of those global concepts is neoliberalism and neoliberal politics. And again, just so I can explain to the people who may be listening, neoliberalism is usually characterized by free market politics, deregulation of corporations, and austerity policies. But there's also a social and political aspect to neoliberalism that often doesn't get talked about. Dr. Brown specifies in one of her books that a behavior that neoliberal politicians engage in, whether they're from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, is performative rhetoric, right? It's very normal to see a politician that backs those kinds of austerity politics and also engage in performative rhetoric to win votes. But when it comes to putting pen to paper and pass substantive legislation, politicians often fall short of that. And when voters see this kind of thing happening, they get disenchanted, they lose trust in the system. And almost always that results in voters putting their faith in strongmen, authoritarian figures. Do you think that both Democratic and Republican politicians in America ever, engage in this kind of performative rhetoric?
I think, look, I'm not a political scientist and I'm not a political historian, but there, from what I can observe, there is some truth to what you're talking about, and there are folks across the ideological spectrum that engage in um, performative rhetoric, and there are people who say things that they don't mean, or they say things that don't align with their votes, and I understand that, but I think at the end of the day, you talked about neoliberalism. At the end of the day, the idea is, um, you know, uh, I think that there is a role for government, right? Like, I think there is a
Yeah.
role for government to do good in this country. And I think there is a role for investments in people and in the institutions that govern us. I am not surprised that there is distrust of government, and that distrust has heightened over the years, and that we are more polarized, and increasingly so. It is uh, government's job uh, to um, prove to the people why it is necessary and why it's important. They have to demonstrate that we can have faith in our leaders. And I think every elected office holder, whether we're talking about city council or all the way up to the president of the United States, has a responsibility to demonstrate why they are right for the job, and they have to continually demonstrate that to the people. What the Trump administration is doing right now, gutting our institutions, ending Medicaid coverage for people, harming people, separating families, making people disappear because they disagree with them. These are things that tear at the fabric of our society. There is going to be long-term harm as a result of the Trump administration's actions. And that's stuff that we're going to have to heal over the course of many years. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take time. But I have hope that we're going to get there. And I have hope that we're going to be able to come out of this moment as
Yeah.
as a stronger and more resilient country, but it's not going to be easy. And it's going to be something that we have to start right now. And we have to
Yeah.
fight back against every moment that we're seeing where the Trump administration is trying to harm our constitutional principles or our democracy. And there are different strategies that we're going to have to take, whether it's litigation, relying on legislation and our Congress, or taking to the streets and making sure that we're out there in droves, registering our discontent, because that is an important aspect of
Yeah.
our work as well.
Absolutely. And I hear you, and I fully appreciate the threat that Trump poses, not only to Americans, but the world at large. But I think there's a bit of a risk when we talk about Trump as the end all be all. And I'm not saying that you've done that at all, but when people, especially in the Democratic Party, focus their campaigns, focus their rhetoric, focus their policies on combating Trump,
Yeah,
combating Trump is not an issue,
it
right?
is not.
Yeah, like poverty is an issue, healthcare is an issue, housing is an issue. And so long as we focus on the boogeyman, I believe that authoritarianism is only going to repeat itself. And that's what the history of political science tells us. The political science tells us we're not in the first or second, but the third wave of authoritarianism right now. And this can not only be understood normatively, but quite quantitatively. We can see the causal factors that led us here. We can see it. And a lot of that has to do with fulfilling your promises. A lot of it has to do with substantive policy work, which is why I have such great respect for the ACLU and the work that you do, because all of this work is tangible and it touches people's lives.
Hey there, if you liked that video, then subscribe to my channel, click on the link in my bio to follow me on Instagram, X, and more.